The wind howled across the barren Montana plains like a banshee's wail, cutting through Ezekiel Thompson's worn coat as he struggled to secure the last of his fence posts. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes that stuck to his graying beard and made every step treacherous across his failing ranch. The cattle had been sold off months ago, leaving only empty corrals and the bitter taste of defeat in his mouth. His wife Martha had passed 3 winters back, taking with her the last warmth this God-forsaken place had ever known. Now it was just him, his arthritic hands, and a mortgage he couldn't pay. The storm had been raging for 2 days straight, and Ezekiel knew his luck was running thin. His meager supplies were dwindling. The roof leaked in 4 places, and the well was starting to freeze over despite his best efforts. He'd heard tell of ranchers found frozen solid in their beds come spring, and the thought made him pull his coat tighter. The bank would foreclose before Easter, that much was certain, but he'd be damned if he'd give up without a fight. This land had been his father's dream, and he'd honor that legacy until his dying breath. As he trudged back toward the ramshackle cabin, something caught his eye near the old oak tree by the creek. At first, he thought it was just another fallen branch, dark against the white snow. But then he saw it move. His heart nearly stopped when he realized what he was looking at. A small figure huddled beneath the bare branches, barely visible in the swirling snow. The child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, dressed in strange leather clothing that offered little protection against the brutal cold. Dark hair plastered to a small head, skin blue with hypothermia. Ezekiel didn't hesitate, scooping the unconscious child into his arms and racing toward his cabin. The little body felt like ice against his chest, so cold he feared he might already be too late. He kicked open the door and carried his burden straight to the fireplace, wrapping the child in every blanket he owned. The features were delicate, almost ethereal, with high cheekbones and copper-toned skin that spoke of native heritage. He'd seen enough frontier children to know this one was different. The clothing, the markings on the leather, everything suggested tribal origins. Working frantically, Ezekiel built up the fire and began the slow process of warming the child. He rubbed the small hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, all the while wondering how anyone so young could have ended up alone in this wilderness. The nearest settlement was 40 miles away, and the closest reservation even farther. He prepared warm broth and waited, praying to a god he'd nearly forgotten how to address. The child's breathing was shallow but steady, and slowly, color began to return to the pale lips. Hours passed before the child stirred, dark eyes fluttering open to gaze up at Ezekiel with a mixture of fear and confusion. They spoke no English, but their eyes held an intelligence that transcended language barriers. Ezekiel offered water and broth, speaking in gentle tones he hadn't used since Martha's passing. The child accepted his care tentatively, studying this weathered white man who had pulled them from death's embrace. There was something ancient in those young eyes, as if they carried wisdom far beyond their years. Through gestures and simple words, Ezekiel learned the child's name was Running Deer, and that they had been lost in the storm for days. The tribal clothing was finely made, suggesting this was no ordinary child, but perhaps someone of importance within their community. Running Deer seemed to understand that Ezekiel meant no harm, gradually relaxing in the warmth of the cabin. They ate slowly, methodically, never taking their eyes off their rescuer's weathered face. Trust was being built one spoonful at a time. As night fell, Ezekiel made a bed near the fire and tucked Running Deer in safely. He sat in his old rocking chair, watching over the child as they slept fitfully, occasionally murmuring words in their native tongue. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, there was peace for the first time in months. He found himself thinking of the children he and Martha had never had, and how empty this place had felt without young voices to fill its corners. Perhaps God had sent him this child for reasons he couldn't yet understand. The next morning dawned clear and bitter cold, with sunlight streaming through the frosted windows like liquid gold. Running Deer was already awake, sitting by the fire and watching Ezekiel with those penetrating dark eyes. They shared a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee, the child grimacing at the bitter taste, but drinking it anyway. There was a dignity in their bearing that impressed the old rancher, a quiet strength that spoke of good breeding and proper upbringing. He wondered what family was mourning this child's disappearance, and his heart ached for their suffering. As Ezekiel stepped outside to tend to his meager chores, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tracks in the snow, lots of them, leading right up to his property line and stopping there. The tracks were unshod ponies and moccasins, dozens of them, as if an entire war party had approached during the night and simply waited. He counted at least 30 different sets of prints, maybe more, all arranged in a perfect semicircle around his land. They had been watching, evaluating, deciding his fate, while he slept peacefully beside the child he'd rescued. Ezekiel's hands trembled as he followed the tracks with his eyes, realizing they formed a complete perimeter around his modest homestead. These weren't random wanderers or a hunting party that had stumbled upon his land by accident. This was organized, deliberate, and spoke of a purpose he couldn't fathom. He'd heard stories of entire families massacred for far less than harboring a lost tribal child, yet something about the careful spacing of the tracks suggested restraint rather than aggression. They could have taken the cabin easily during the night, but they hadn't. The question was why. Racing back inside, Ezekiel found Running Deer standing at the window, small hands pressed against the glass as they stared out at the horizon. The child's expression had changed completely. Gone was the confusion and fear of the previous day, replaced by something that looked almost like anticipation. When Running Deer turned to face him, there was a knowing look in those dark eyes that made Ezekiel's stomach clench with worry. The child spoke rapidly in their native tongue, gesturing toward the window with obvious excitement. It was clear they recognized something in the landscape that Ezekiel couldn't see. "Who are you, little one?" Ezekiel whispered, kneeling down to Running Deer's level and searching those ancient-seeming eyes for answers. The child tilted their head, studying his weathered face with the same intensity he'd seen in tribal elders during his younger days working cattle drives. There was nobility in the child's bearing, a quiet confidence that spoke of high birth or special status within their community. The leather clothing was too fine, too carefully decorated, with intricate beadwork and symbols that suggested ceremonial importance rather than everyday wear. Running Deer moved to the old wooden table and began tracing patterns in the dust with their finger, symbols that looked like mountains, rivers, and what might have been birds or spirits. Ezekiel recognized none of them, but he could sense their importance by the reverence with which the child drew each mark. When Running Deer pointed to themselves and then to a particular symbol that resembled a soaring eagle, understanding began to dawn. This wasn't just any lost child. This was someone whose absence would be felt deeply by their people, someone worth sending warriors to find. The morning passed in tense silence as Ezekiel went about his chores, constantly scanning the horizon for signs of approaching riders. Running Deer followed him everywhere, chattering in their native language and seeming completely at ease despite the obvious danger surrounding them. The child helped feed his few remaining chickens and even attempted to assist with mending a fence post, their small hands surprisingly skilled with rope and tools. It was as if they had decided Ezekiel was family, and the old rancher found his heart warming despite his fear. By midday, the tracks in the snow had been joined by fresh ones, more ponies, more moccasins, creating an ever-tightening circle around the property. Ezekiel estimated at least 50 warriors now surrounded his land, yet still they made no move to attack. When he mentioned this to Running Deer through gestures and broken words, the child simply smiled and patted his arm reassuringly. That smile held secrets Ezekiel couldn't begin to understand, but it also held a strange comfort. Perhaps his death wouldn't come today after all. As the sun reached its peak, Running Deer suddenly became agitated, rushing to the window and pressing their face against the glass with obvious excitement. They called out words in their language that sounded like celebration, like joy, pointing frantically at something beyond Ezekiel's view. When he joined them at the window, his heart nearly stopped. The horizon was black with riders, not 50, but hundreds, approaching in perfect formation across the snow-covered plains. War paint, feathers and weapons gleamed in the winter sunlight as what looked like an entire tribe converged on his humble ranch. Ezekiel reached for his old rifle, knowing it would be useless against such numbers, but needing to feel its familiar weight in his hands. Running Deer caught his arm and shook their head firmly, those dark eyes holding no fear, only determination. The child spoke rapidly, urgently, as if trying to explain something crucial that language barriers prevented. Their small hands moved in graceful gestures that seemed to tell a story, pointing to themselves, to Ezekiel, to the approaching warriors, weaving a narrative he desperately wished he could understand. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, like thunder rolling across the frozen earth, and Ezekiel felt his legs grow weak with terror. This was it. His last day on earth, all because he'd shown mercy to a lost child. Yet when he looked down at Running Deer, he felt no regret. If saving this young life meant his own death, then perhaps it was a worthy trade. Martha would have understood. She'd always said his heart was too soft for the harsh realities of frontier life. Now that softness would be his undoing. As the first riders crested the hill near his property line, Ezekiel was amazed to see they had stopped in perfect formation, just as the tracks had suggested they would. No war cries split the air, no arrows flew toward his cabin. Instead, the warriors sat motionless on their ponies, watching and waiting with the patience of men who understood something he did not. Running Deer bounced on their toes with excitement, pressing both hands against the window as if greeting old friends. Whatever was about to happen, the child was eager for it to begin, and that gave Ezekiel the strangest sensation that perhaps, just perhaps, he had misunderstood everything. Dawn broke like a revelation across the Montana plains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson that took Ezekiel's breath away. He had barely slept, spending the night watching the silent warriors who maintained their vigil around his property with supernatural discipline. Not once had they moved from their positions, sitting like bronze statues in the freezing cold while their ponies pawed at the snow beneath their feet. Running Deer had slept peacefully by the fire, occasionally murmuring words that sounded like prayers or songs in their native tongue. The child's serenity in the face of such overwhelming odds continued to baffle and comfort the old rancher. As the first rays of sunlight touched the cabin walls, Running Deer stirred and immediately rushed to the window with an excitement that bordered on reverence. The child's eyes sparkled with tears of joy as they pointed toward the eastern horizon, speaking rapidly in words that carried the cadence of ceremony and celebration. Ezekiel followed their gaze and gasped at what he saw. The warriors were dismounting from their ponies and beginning to move with purpose, but not toward his cabin. Instead, they were arranging themselves in intricate patterns across his land, creating what looked like sacred geometry in the snow. The transformation was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. Warriors, who moments before had seemed poised for battle, were now kneeling in the snow, placing objects from leather pouches into carefully arranged displays. Ezekiel could see furs, beadwork, pottery, and what appeared to be food being laid out in elaborate patterns that stretched across his entire property. The morning air filled with the sound of chanting, low and melodic, as if the earth itself was singing. Running Deer pressed their small hands against the glass and began to hum along, tears streaming down their copper-toned cheeks. "What in tarnation?" Ezekiel breathed, his rifle forgotten as he watched the most extraordinary scene of his 63 years unfold before his eyes. The warriors moved with choreographed precision, each knowing exactly where to place their offerings and when to begin their portion of what was clearly an ancient ceremony. Smoke began rising from small fires scattered throughout the display, carrying the scent of burning sage and sweetgrass through the crisp morning air. This wasn't preparation for war. This was something far more sacred and mysterious. Running Deer tugged at Ezekiel's sleeve and pointed to themselves, then to a magnificent warrior who had positioned himself at the center of the display. Even from a distance, Ezekiel could see this man was different, taller, more regal, wearing feathers and ornaments that spoke of the highest rank. When the warrior raised his arms to the sky and called out in a voice that carried across the plains like the cry of an eagle, Running Deer responded with their own call, clear and strong despite their young age. The recognition between them was unmistakable. This was family, and not just any family, any. The realization hit Ezekiel like a physical blow as pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place. Running Deer wasn't just any lost child. They were royalty, the son or daughter of a chief, possibly even a future leader whose disappearance had mobilized an entire nation. The fine clothing, the ancient wisdom in young eyes, the way the warriors had surrounded his property with such careful respect, it all made sense now. He had saved the most precious thing these people possessed, and they had come not for war, but for something he couldn't yet comprehend. As if responding to some invisible signal, the great warrior at the center of the display began walking toward Ezekiel's cabin, his steps measured and deliberate. He was an imposing figure, easily 6.5 feet tall, with silver threading through his black braids and scars that spoke of countless battles. Yet his expression held no anger or threat. Instead, there was something that looked almost like gratitude mixed with profound relief. Behind him, other warriors began lifting enormous platters and baskets, moving in procession toward the humble ranch house. Running Deer could contain their excitement no longer and raced for the door, practically vibrating with joy as they waited for Ezekiel to open it. When he hesitated, the child took his weathered hand in their small one and squeezed gently, those dark eyes conveying trust and reassurance that transcended language. Whatever was about to happen, Running Deer wanted him to be part of it, needed him to understand that he was safe, honored even. With trembling fingers, Ezekiel lifted the latch and opened the door to face whatever destiny awaited him. The great warrior stopped 10 feet from the cabin steps and spoke in perfect accented English that carried the weight of formal ceremony. "White hair who shows mercy," he said, his deep voice resonating with respect and solemnity. "I am Chief Standing Bear of the Lakota Nation, and you have returned to me that which is more precious than life itself." He gestured to Running Deer, who had rushed to his side and was now wrapped in the chief's powerful embrace. "My grandchild, the future keeper of our sacred ways, was lost to the storm spirits. You gave them warmth when they faced the cold embrace of death." Ezekiel's knees nearly buckled as the full magnitude of what he had done washed over him. He had saved not just any child, but the grandchild of one of the most powerful chiefs in the territory, a future spiritual leader whose loss would have devastated an entire people. The old rancher opened his mouth to speak, but Chief Standing Bear raised his hand for silence. "The spirits guided my grandchild to your door for a reason, Whitehair who shows mercy. They have seen your heart, your kindness to one who was not of your blood or tribe. Now we honor you as our people honor those who preserve the sacred circle of life." What followed was the most magnificent display Ezekiel had ever witnessed in his long life on the frontier. The warriors came forward in waves, each carrying offerings that represented the wealth and gratitude of their entire nation. Buffalo hides soft as silk, intricately beaded clothing that must have taken months to create, pottery painted with symbols that told ancient stories, and baskets woven so tightly they could hold water. Weapons of ceremonial beauty, tomahawks with handles carved from sacred wood, bows decorated with eagle feathers, and knives whose blades gleamed like mirrors in the morning sun. The value of these gifts would have made Ezekiel wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. But the food, sweet mercy, the food, was what truly overwhelmed his senses and brought tears to his eyes. Whole roasted deer carried on wooden stretchers, their meat seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify, but that filled the air with mouth-watering aromas. Clay pots filled with corn stew, thick with wild vegetables, flatbreads still warm from cooking fires, and dried fruits that spoke of careful preparation and precious reserves shared in his honor. Fish from distant rivers, birds from the sky, roots and berries that represented the very essence of the land itself. It was a feast fit for a king, laid out in his humble yard by people who could have taken everything he owned, but chose instead to give everything they had. Chief Standing Bear approached with a leather pouch decorated with porcupine quills and beadwork so intricate it seemed to shimmer in the morning light. "This contains the sacred tobacco of our people," he explained in his deep, resonant voice. "And with it, the promise that you and your descendants will always be welcome in our lodges. You are no longer a stranger in this land, white hair who shows mercy. You are Wisinkala, family, bound to us by the sacred act of preserving life when death stalked close." He placed the pouch in Ezekiel's trembling hands, with the reverence reserved for the most holy of ceremonies. Running Deer ran to Ezekiel and wrapped their small arms around his weathered legs, chattering excitedly in a mixture of Lakota and the few English words they had learned during their brief stay. Chief Standing Bear translated with obvious pride and affection. "My grandchild says you are the kindest grandfather they have ever known, and that your heart burns with the same fire as the sacred flames of our sweat lodge. They wish to give you a name in our tongue, Wikapi Waste, which means good star, for you were their guiding light in the darkness of the storm." The old rancher found himself crying openly, overwhelmed by an honor he felt utterly unworthy to receive. As the morning progressed, the ceremony took on an almost dreamlike quality that Ezekiel knew he would remember until his dying day. Warriors who had seemed so fearsome in the distance revealed themselves to be fathers and sons, brothers and uncles, all united in their joy at Running Deer's safe return. They shared stories through gestures and the few words of English some possessed, telling him of their long search through the blizzard, their desperation when the child's trail was lost, and their amazement when scouts reported seeing smoke from his chimney on the night Running Deer was found. Some wept openly as they touched the child's face, as if confirming they were real and alive. The feast that followed was unlike anything Ezekiel had ever experienced, transforming his barren property into a place of celebration and abundance. Tables made from stretched hides groaned under the weight of food that kept appearing as if by magic, while warriors and their families, for Ezekiel now realized many had brought wives and children, shared their bounty with the generosity that comes from hearts overflowing with gratitude. He found himself seated beside Chief Standing Bear, treated not as a curiosity or outsider, but as an honored elder whose wisdom and kindness had earned him a permanent place in their tribal memory. As the sun reached its zenith, Chief Standing Bear rose and raised his hands for silence, preparing to address both his people and the man who had saved his precious grandchild. In all our stories passed down from the grandfathers of our grandfathers, we are taught that the Great Spirit places tests before us to measure the truth of our hearts. Today we have learned that goodness knows no boundaries of blood or tribe, that mercy can shine from the most unexpected places. His eyes found Ezekiel's weathered face. "Wikapi Waste, you have shown us that the sacred circle includes all who choose love over fear, kindness over cruelty. Our people will sing of your deed for generations yet to come." Running Deer approached Ezekiel one final time, their young face serious with the weight of ceremony and tradition. In their small hands, they carried a necklace of polished stones and carved bone, each piece telling a story of their lineage and spiritual heritage. Chief Standing Bear spoke softly as the child placed it around Ezekiel's neck. "This has been worn by the spiritual leaders of our family for 7 generations. My grandchild insists you must have it, for they say your spirit called to theirs across the storm winds and guided them to safety. In our ways, this makes you their spiritual grandfather, bound to them and to us forever." The ceremony concluded as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed to bless the gathering with divine approval. One by one, the warriors and their families approached Ezekiel, each offering a gesture of respect. A touch to the shoulder, a bow of the head, words in Lakota that needed no translation to convey their meaning. They mounted their ponies with the same discipline they had shown throughout, but now their departure felt like family saying goodbye rather than strangers taking their leave. Chief Standing Bear was the last to go, grasping Ezekiel's hand in both of his own. As the dust settled and silence returned to his land, Ezekiel stood among the incredible bounty that surrounded his humble cabin and felt a transformation in his very soul. The crushing loneliness that had plagued him since Martha's death was gone, replaced by the warm knowledge that he was part of something larger than himself, connected to a people who had claimed him as family. The mortgage that had seemed so insurmountable that morning now felt manageable, with the wealth of goods he had been given, but more importantly, he had wealth of spirit that no bank could foreclose upon. Perhaps the greatest gifts weren't always wrapped in the packages we expected, but came instead in the form of frozen children who needed our warmth, and in doing so, warmed our hearts forever.